The day Mary Foster buried her husband, the skies over Desdemona, Texas opened up like they were mourning right along with her. April Yates stood beside the fresh grave, rainwater mixing with tears as her mother-in-law's voice cut through the downpour. "I always told my son he married beneath him," Margaret Yates said, loud enough for the remaining mourners to hear. "A woman who can't even give him children. Useless. Completely useless." April clutched her black shawl tighter around her shoulders, the pain of Margaret's words cutting deeper than the cold rain ever could. 3 years of marriage to Thomas Yates, 3 years of trying to conceive, and now he was gone, taken by typhoid fever at just 28 years old. The cruel irony was that April had discovered she was with child only 2 days before Thomas fell ill. She never got the chance to tell him. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Margaret, especially not Margaret. The year was 1874, and in Desdemona, Texas, a young widow with no family and a baby on the way faced few promising prospects. At 22, April should have been preparing a nursery with her husband, not watching his coffin be lowered into the soggy earth while his mother blamed her for every disappointment in their short marriage. Miss April. Mary Foster, the town's midwife who had recently confirmed April's pregnancy, took her elbow gently. "You shouldn't be standing in this rain in your condition." "I need to stay until the end," April whispered, her voice breaking. "I owe him that much." The Reverend said his final words, and the small gathering began to disperse, hurrying to their carriages and horses to escape the downpour. Only Margaret lingered, her tall, rigid frame unmoved by the weather. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked, her tone suggesting she already had the answer. "The house belongs to the Yates family, always has." "I know, Margaret," April replied softly. "You'll be out by the end of the month. I'll be selling it." Margaret's gray eyes narrowed. "My son wasted 3 years on you. I won't waste another day." April opened her mouth to tell Margaret about the baby, her grandchild, but the words caught in her throat. The venom in the older woman's voice made her realize that even this news wouldn't soften her heart. If anything, Margaret might try to take the child from her, claiming April was unfit to raise a Yates. "I understand," April said instead, straightening her spine despite the crushing weight of grief. "I'll be gone before then." 2 weeks later, April sat in Mary Foster's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, her meager belongings packed in a single trunk in the corner. "You could stay here with me," Mary offered, not for the first time. "At least until after the baby comes." April shook her head. "Margaret has too much influence in Desdemona. If she found out about the baby—" She didn't finish the thought. They both knew. "Then where will you go, child?" "My cousin has a small place near Fort Worth." She wrote back saying I could stay with her for a while. Mary sighed, her weathered face creasing with concern. "That's a difficult journey for a woman alone, especially one in your condition." "I'll find a way," April insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "There's a cattle drive leaving tomorrow," Mary said thoughtfully, "headed to Fort Worth. The foreman is Maxwell York. Good man, from what I hear. Maybe he could use a cook or someone to help with mending." April considered it. She had little money, but she was a skilled cook, and seamstress talents Margaret had always dismissed as inadequate for a Yates wife. "I'll speak to him first thing in the morning," April decided, feeling the first flicker of hope since Thomas's death. "Thank you, Mary." The sun was barely cresting the horizon when April approached the gathering of cowboys on the outskirts of town. 15 men, 20 horses, and nearly 300 head of cattle created a chaotic scene as they prepared to move out. She spotted Maxwell York immediately. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his responsibilities, he was issuing orders in a deep voice that carried authority without cruelty. His brown Stetson was pulled low over his face, but she could see a strong jawline covered in a few days' stubble. April waited until he finished speaking with one of his men before approaching. "Mr. York, excuse me, Mr. York," he turned, and April found herself looking into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They stood out against his sun-darkened skin like sapphires. "Yes, madam." He replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that was becoming increasingly rare. "My name is April Yates. I'm looking for work, and I heard your drive could use a cook or someone skilled with a needle. She forced herself to maintain eye contact despite her nervousness. I'm hoping to reach Fort Worth and I can work for my passage. Maxwell studied her for a long moment, taking in her plain dress and the determined set of her jaw. She knew what he was seeing: a young woman, too refined for a cattle drive, with no obvious reason to leave town in such a manner. Mrs. Yates, he said finally, a cattle drive is no place for a lady. It's rough country, rough men, and rough living. I'm aware of the conditions, Mr. York. I'm not afraid of hard work. And your husband, where is he in this plan? The question stung, but April kept her composure. My husband passed away 2 weeks ago. I have family in Fort Worth who can take me in, but I need to get there first. Something in Maxwell's expression shifted, a softening around his eyes. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Yates. He glanced back at his men, then at the provisions wagon. We do have a cook, but he's got a bad case of rheumatism in his hands. Having someone who could help with the food and mending would be useful. Hope surged in April's chest. I'm very handy in the kitchen, and I can sew anything from torn trousers to leather tack. Maxwell nodded slowly. It's a 3-week journey if the weather holds. You'd be the only woman among 15 men. I trust you run a respectful outfit, Mr. York. A hint of a smile touched his lips. That I do, Mrs. Yates. He gestured toward the provisions wagon. You'll ride there with Cookie. We leave in 30 minutes. Anything you need to fetch before then? My trunk is at Mary Foster's house. I can retrieve it quickly. I'll send one of my men to help you, Illy, he called, and a young cowboy hurried over. Help Mrs. Yates collect her things from town. She'll be joining us as far as Fort Worth. As April followed Illy back toward Mary's house, she felt Maxwell's gaze on her back. She wasn't sure what life held beyond today, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt a glimmer of possibility. That glimmer dimmed considerably when she climbed into the provisions wagon an hour later. Old Cookie, as everyone called him, was indeed suffering from rheumatism, but his sour disposition seemed unaffected by his ailment. Don't touch nothin' unless I tell you to, he grumbled as April settled herself on the bench beside him. Been cookin' for trail drives longer than you been alive, girl. I'm here to help, not take over, April assured him, tucking her skirts around her legs as the wagon lurched forward. Cookie snorted. Women always think they know better in a kitchen. April bit her tongue. This was going to be a long 3 weeks. The first day passed in a blur of dust, jolting wagon rides, and Cookie's constant criticism. By evening, when the cattle were settled and the men were hungry, April's back ached and her patience was worn thin. Still, she worked alongside Cookie, preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits. As she served the men, she became aware of their curious glances. Most were respectful enough, nodding their thanks as she filled their tin plates. A few made polite conversation, asking where she was from or commenting on how good the food tasted compared to Cookie's usual fare. Maxwell ate last, approaching the fire after ensuring his men and cattle were taken care of. April handed him a plate, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Thank you, Mrs. Yates, he said, his deep voice somehow softer than it had been when addressing his men. The men are saying this is the best meal they've had on a drive in years. April felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Cookie did most of the work. I just helped with the biscuits. Those biscuits alone would be worth bringing you along, Maxwell said with a smile that transformed his rugged face. How are you holding up? First day on the trail can be the hardest. I'm fine, April insisted, though her aching back and feet suggested otherwise. Nothing I can't handle. Maxwell looked like he might say more, but Cookie called for help cleaning up, and April excused herself. As she worked, she felt Maxwell's eyes on her more than once. That night, April slept under the wagon, wrapped in the blankets Mary had insisted she take. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. She was acutely aware of the men sleeping nearby, the sounds of cattle in the distance, and the unfamiliar night sounds of the open Texas plain. Somewhere in the early morning hours, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Fear gripped her until a familiar voice spoke softly. Just checking that you're all right, Mrs. Yates, Maxwell said from a respectful distance. Night watch noticed you were restless. I'm fine, April whispered, touched by his concern. just adjusting to sleeping outdoors. It gets easier, he assured her. Try to rest. Tomorrow's another long day. As he walked away, April realized she felt safer knowing he was watching over the camp over her. It was a feeling she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. The days began to blend together as the cattle drive moved steadily northeast toward Fort Worth. April settled into a routine, rising before dawn to help Cookie prepare breakfast, then riding in the wagon all day, mending clothes and tack during breaks, and helping with the evening meal. She learned the names and personalities of all the cowboys. Illy, who had helped with her trunk, was the youngest at just 19. Old Cookie was nearing 60. There was talkative Sam, quiet Pablo, quick-tempered Frank, and jovial twins Ben and Bart, but it was Maxwell who intrigued her most. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, the men listened. He was fair but firm, and April noticed how he took the most difficult night watches and ate only after everyone else had been served. She also noticed how his eyes would find her across the camp, checking that she was comfortable, that she had enough to eat, that she wasn't struggling with her tasks. On the fifth night, after the men had turned in and only the night watch remained awake, April sat by the dying fire, sewing a tear in one of Maxwell's shirts. He approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might like some," he said, offering her one. April accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, the nights are getting cooler." Maxwell settled on a log across from her, watching as her needle flashed in and out of the fabric. "You don't have to mend that tonight, it could wait until morning." "I don't mind," April said. "Keeps my hands busy." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling fire and distant lowing of cattle. "You mentioned you have family in Fort Worth," Maxwell finally said. "Close kin," April hesitated. "A cousin." "We haven't seen each other in years, but she's the only family I have left." Maxwell nodded, studying his coffee. "And in Desdemona, no one there to help after your husband passed?" The question brought back the memory of Margaret's cold eyes and cruel words. "My mother-in-law made it clear I wasn't welcome to stay," April said, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "The house belonged to her family and without Thomas." She trailed off, focusing on her sewing. "I'm sorry," Maxwell said softly. "Losing a husband is hard enough without losing your home too." April's hands stilled. "She never approved of me, said I was useless because," she stopped herself, not ready to share the full truth with anyone, even someone as kind as Maxwell seemed to be. "Because," he prompted gently. April shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." She tied off her thread and snipped it with small scissors from her sewing kit. "Here," she said, handing him the mended shirt, "good as new." Maxwell accepted it, his fingers brushing hers again. This time the contact lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Mrs. Yates." "April," she said suddenly. "Please call me April. Mrs. Yates reminds me of—" "Your mother-in-law," Maxwell guessed, a slight smile softening his features. April nodded, returning his smile hesitantly. "Then you must call me Max," he said. "Only my mother ever called me Maxwell, and only when I was in trouble." It was the first time April had laughed since Thomas died, a small but genuine sound that surprised them both. "Good night, April," Max said, rising from his seat. "Good night, Max," she replied, watching as he walked away, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the starry Texas sky. The next morning, April woke feeling queasy, a reminder of her condition that she'd been trying to ignore. She managed to help with breakfast, though the smell of frying bacon made her stomach turn. By mid-morning, riding in the jostling wagon became unbearable, and she asked Cookie to stop. April barely made it a few steps from the wagon before emptying her stomach into the tall grass. When she straightened, wiping her mouth with a handkerchief, she found Max riding toward her, concern evident on his face. "Are you ill?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "Just a touch of stomach upset," April said, embarrassed. "The wagon ride is a bit rough today." Max frowned, clearly not convinced. "We're pushing too hard. You're not used to this kind of travel." "I'll be fine," April insisted. "Please don't worry about me." Before Max could respond, Cookie called from the wagon, "We need to keep moving if we want to make the creek by nightfall." Max's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Rest for a moment. I'll help you back to the wagon." As they walked slowly back, Max kept a respectful distance but remained close enough to catch her if she faltered. "If you're still feeling unwell tonight, I have some peppermint tea that might help," he offered. April thanked him, touched by his thoughtfulness. She climbed back into the wagon, determined to hide her morning's sickness better in the days to come. The last thing she needed was for anyone to discover her secret, especially Max. That evening, true to his word, Max brought her a cup of peppermint tea after dinner. "My mother swore by this for any stomach ailment," he said, sitting beside her at the fire. April sipped the tea gratefully, feeling the warm liquid soothe her queasy stomach. "It's perfect, thank you." Max watched her over the rim of his own cup. "May I ask you something personal, April?" April tensed but nodded, preparing herself for questions about her marriage or her husband's death. "What will you do in Fort Worth? Besides staying with your cousin, I mean." The question caught her off guard. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "Find work, I suppose. I'm good with numbers. I kept the books for my husband's general store in Desdemona." Max looked surprised. "You ran a store with Thomas?" "Yes. His father started it and Thomas took over when he passed. We did well until—" April paused, the memory of those final days still raw, until the typhoid outbreak. "I'm sorry," Max said quietly. "That's a terrible way to lose someone." April nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she looked up, Max was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, sympathy mixed with something deeper, more searching. "What about you?" she asked, eager to shift the focus. "Have you always been a cattle driver?" Max smiled slightly. "No, madam. I was raised on a ranch near Austin. My father was a rancher, his father before him. I worked our land until the war came." April didn't need to ask which war. The war between the states had ended 9 years ago, but its effects still rippled through Texas and beyond. "I fought for 4 years," Max continued, his voice growing distant. "When I came home, the ranch was in ruins. My father had died. My mother was trying to hold things together with just a few head of cattle and no help." He stared into the fire. "I spent 3 years rebuilding, but then my mother passed too. After that, I couldn't see the point in staying. Sold what was left and started working drives. Been doing it for 6 years now." "No wife, family of your own?" April asked before she could stop herself. Max shook his head. "Never found the right woman. Or maybe I never stayed in one place long enough to look properly." His eyes met hers across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. April looked away first, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this conversation might seem to others. She was a recent widow, and here she was, sharing personal stories with a man she barely knew. "I should get some rest," she said, rising from her seat. "Thank you for the tea, it helped." Max stood as well, towering over her in the firelight. "Anytime, April, good night." As April settled under the wagon that night, she found herself thinking about Max's story about the loneliness that seemed to echo her own. Despite their different paths, they both knew what it meant to lose everything and have to start again. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. The next week passed with increasing difficulty for April. Her morning sickness worsened, though she became more adept at hiding it, slipping away at dawn before anyone but the night watch was awake. She was exhausted by evening, barely able to keep her eyes open through dinner, Max noticed. April caught him watching her with concern more than once, but he never pressed her about her health again after that first day. Instead, he found small ways to make her journey easier. A cushion for the wagon seat appeared one morning. A canteen of fresh water was left near her bedroll each night, and somehow the wagon's path seemed to avoid the roughest terrain. On the 10th day of the journey, disaster struck. A sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the northwest, bringing lightning that spooked the cattle. Before the cowboys could contain them, the herd was stampeding, hundreds of hooves churning the muddy ground into a deadly quagmire. April watched in horror from the relative safety of the halted wagon as Max and his men fought to control the panicked animals. The rain came down in sheets, making visibility poor and the ground treacherous. A cry went up from one of the men. He had been thrown from his horse and was directly in the path of the stampeding cattle. Without hesitation, Max spurred his horse toward the fallen cowboy, leaning low in the saddle as he raced against the oncoming herd. April's heart seemed to stop as she watched Max reach Ely and haul him onto the horse in one powerful movement. They barely cleared the path of the stampede, Max's horse scrambling up a small rise just as the cattle thundered past. When the chaos finally settled, 3 men had minor injuries, and they'd lost about 20 head of cattle. But everyone was alive, thanks largely to Max's quick thinking and bravery. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a soggy camp and exhausted men in its wake. April worked alongside Cookie, preparing a hot meal while the men rounded up the scattered cattle. Max was the last to return, his clothes caked with mud, his face lined with fatigue. April handed him a plate of food and a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I thought you were going to be trampled," she said quietly. Max accepted the food with a weary smile. "Takes more than a few angry longhorns to get the better of me. It was brave, what you did for Ely." Max shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Any of my men would have done the same." April wanted to say more, to tell him how her heart had nearly stopped watching him race into danger, how she'd prayed with more fervor than she had since Thomas fell ill, but she held her tongue. Such thoughts were inappropriate for a widow of less than a month. Instead, she said, "Let me know if you need any of your clothes mended after today. That shirt looks like it might be beyond saving." Max glanced down at his mud-caked shirt and chuckled. "Might be right about that. Thank you, April." As he walked away to check on his men, April realized with a start that her feelings for Max were growing into something she wasn't prepared for. Something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. That night, sleep eluded April completely. Her mind kept replaying the image of Max racing toward danger, and each time, the outcome in her imagination was worse than what had actually happened. By dawn, she was exhausted and emotionally raw. She slipped away from camp to deal with her morning sickness, finding a secluded spot behind some scrubby trees. As she knelt in the dirt, retching painfully, she heard footsteps approaching. "April," Max's voice was soft with concern. "Are you all right?" April tried to straighten up to compose herself, but another wave of nausea hit her. Max was beside her in an instant, holding back her hair with one hand, the other supporting her elbow. When the sickness passed, April sat back on her heels, mortified. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she whispered. Max offered his canteen and she rinsed her mouth gratefully. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face. April looked away. "It's nothing, just the travel. Every morning at the same time." Max's voice was gentle but knowing. "April, are you with child?" The directness of his question startled her. In 1874, such matters weren't discussed openly, especially not between a man and woman who weren't married to each other. But there was no judgment in Max's eyes, only concern. April's silence was answer enough. "Does anyone else know?" he asked quietly. "Only Mary Foster, the midwife in Desdemona," April admitted. "I found out just before Thomas fell ill. He never knew." Max was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "And your mother-in-law. Is that why she called you useless? Because she thought you couldn't give Thomas children?" April nodded, tears pricking her eyes. 3 years we tried, nothing. Then when it finally happened, he wasn't there to know." A sob escaped her. "And now she's thrown me out, not knowing she's sending away her own grandchild." Without hesitation, Max drew her into his arms, holding her as she cried for the first time since the funeral. His embrace was strong yet gentle, his hand making soothing circles on her back. "You're far from useless, April Yates," he murmured into her hair. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met." April gradually became aware of how inappropriate their position was, a widow in the arms of a man who wasn't her husband, hidden from view of the camp. She pulled away reluctantly, wiping her tears. "Thank you," she said softly, "for your kindness." Max helped her to her feet, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow. "Your secret is safe with me," he assured her, "but you should be resting more, eating better. That wagon can't be comfortable." "I have no choice," April reminded him. "I need to reach Fort Worth." Max frowned thoughtfully. "We'll figure something out. In the meantime, I want you to ride in my bedroll in the back of the wagon. It's softer than that bench, and I'm going to make sure Cookie gives you extra portions." "The men will talk," April protested. "Let them," Max said firmly. Anyone who disrespects you will answer to me." The intensity in his voice sent a shiver through April that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She nodded her agreement, too exhausted to argue further. As they walked back to camp together, April wondered what Thomas would think of her situation now pregnant, homeless, and developing feelings for a man she'd known less than 2 weeks. The thought brought a fresh wave of guilt that stayed with her throughout the day. That evening, as April served dinner to the men, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Heard the boss asking if any of us knew midwifing," Sam was saying to Ellie. "Reckon Mrs. Yates might be in the family way." "No surprise there," Frank chimed in with a smirk. "Widow, no home to go to bet that baby ain't even her dead husband's," Ellie frowned. "That's a terrible thing to say, Frank. Mrs. Yates is a lady. Lady or not, she's mighty friendly with the boss these days," Frank persisted. "Seen them talking alone by the fire more'n once." April's hands shook as she continued serving, pretending not to hear. When she reached Max, sitting slightly apart from his men as usual, she couldn't meet his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, pitching his voice low. "Nothing," April lied, serving him quickly and moving on. But Max wasn't fooled. After dinner, he found her by the washing basin, scrubbing pots with more force than necessary. "Tell me," he said simply. April glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "The men know, or at least they suspect, about the baby," her voice broke. "And they're saying terrible things that it might not be Thomas's, that you and I." Max's expression darkened. "Who said this?" "It doesn't matter," April said quickly. "But if the men are talking, it could damage your reputation as a foreman. I don't want that." "I don't give a damn about my reputation," Max said fiercely. "But I won't have them slandering yours." Before April could stop him, Max strode to the center of camp and called for the men's attention. The cowboys gathered quickly, sensing their boss's unusual mood. "It's come to my attention that there's been talk about Mrs. Yates," Max said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet night. "Let me make something clear. Mrs. Yates is a respectable widow traveling under my protection. Any man who suggests otherwise will be looking for a new job come morning." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "Furthermore, Mrs. Yates is expecting a child, her late husband's child. She'll be needing extra care on this journey, and I expect each of you to show her the respect and consideration you'd want shown to your own sister or mother. Is that understood?" A chorus of yes, boss, and nods answered him. "Good," Max said. "Now, Frank, I believe you have first watch tonight." Frank's face flushed at being singled out, confirming April's suspicion that he'd been the source of the worst rumors. The cowboy nodded stiffly and moved to take his position. April stood frozen by the washing basin, mortified yet touched by Max's defense of her honor. When he returned to her side, she couldn't find words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that was public, but it needed to be done. No one will speak against you now." "Thank you," April finally managed, "but you didn't have to tell them about the baby." "Better they know the truth than make up their own stories," Max said firmly. "And now they'll understand why you need extra rest and care." April looked up at him, this man who had appointed himself her protector without being asked. "Why are you doing all this for me, Max?" Max's expression softened. "Because you deserve it, April. Because he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Because it's the right thing to do." April sensed there was more he wanted to say, but she didn't press. Her own feelings were too confused, too raw to examine closely. "Good night, Max," she said softly, turning back to her washing. "Good night, April," he replied, and she felt his gaze linger on her before he walked away. That night, lying in Max's bedroll in the back of the wagon as he had insisted, April felt safer than she had in weeks. Whatever rumors the men might still whisper, whatever uncertain future awaited her in Fort Worth, she knew she had at least one person in the world who truly cared what happened to her. The thought warmed her as she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since Thomas died. The remaining days of the journey passed more comfortably for April. True to Max's orders, the men treated her with increased respect, even offering to help with chores that would normally fall to her. Old Cookie, gruff as ever, nevertheless ensured she had the choicest portions at meals and even allowed her to rest while he handled more of the cooking. And Max was a constant presence, checking on her throughout the day, Bringing her ginger candies he'd purchased from a trading post, they passed to help with her nausea, finding excuses to ride beside the wagon so they could talk. Their conversations ranged from childhood memories to dreams for the future, books they'd read, and places they'd seen. April learned that Max had a dry wit that emerged when he was comfortable, that he loved poetry but would never admit it to his men, that he could identify every star in the Texas sky. In turn, she told him about growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher in East Texas, how she'd met Thomas when he came to buy supplies for his store, how they'd courted for just 6 weeks before marrying. She spoke of her love of numbers and books, her dream of one day opening a small library in whatever town she settled in. The more they talked, the more April found herself drawn to Max, not just his handsome face and strong hands, but his mind, his principles, his gentle heart hidden beneath the tough exterior of a trail boss. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart race in a way it never had, even with Thomas. The guilt that followed such thoughts was immediate and crushing. Thomas had been a good husband, kind, if not passionate, supportive, if not understanding. He didn't deserve to be so quickly forgotten by his widow, especially one carrying his child. 5 days from Fort Worth, they made camp early beside a clear, shallow creek. The weather had turned warmer, and Max announced that everyone would have a chance to bathe and wash their clothes. He set up a rotation so April could have privacy at the creek first, with Old Cookie standing guard at a discreet distance to ensure none of the men ventured too close. The cool water was heavenly against April's skin as she quickly bathed, washing away 2 weeks of trail dust and sweat. She had just finished dressing in her cleanest remaining outfit when she heard Cookie call out a warning. "Riders coming, Mrs. Yates. Best get back to camp." April gathered her wet things and hurried back, arriving just as 3 riders approached the camp. Max stood waiting for them, his stance casual but alert. "Afternoon," he called as they drew near. "Something we can help you with." The lead rider, a thin man with a patchy beard and a knife scar across one cheek, smiled insincerely. "Just passing through, thought we'd water our horses at your creek." "Help yourselves," Max said evenly. "Creek's open to all." April moved to stand near Cookie's wagon, instinctively seeking its shelter. She didn't like the way the riders were scanning the camp, their eyes lingering on the provisions, the horses, and finally on her. The scarred man noticed her attention and tipped his hat mockingly. "Afternoon, madam." "Don't often see womenfolk on cattle drives." April nodded stiffly but didn't reply. "My sister-in-law," Max said smoothly, moving slightly to place himself between April and the strangers. "We're taking her to join her husband in Fort Worth." April understood immediately Max was creating a fiction to protect her. A sister-in-law traveling to her husband would be less vulnerable than a widow traveling alone. The scarred man's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he sensed the lie but couldn't be certain. "Mighty accommodating of you." "Family's family," Max replied with a shrug. "Creek's that way if you're still interested." It was a dismissal, polite but firm. The scarred man hesitated, clearly weighing his options as he took in the number of cowboys now casually gathering around the camp, many with hands resting near their guns. "Much obliged," he finally said, gesturing to his companions. "Boys, let's water the horses and move on." As the 3 riders headed toward the creek, Max turned to April. "Stay close to camp until they're gone," he said quietly. "I don't like the look of them." April nodded, her earlier sense of peace shattered by the encounter. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Hard to say," Max admitted. "But we'll post extra guards tonight just in case." True to his word, Max doubled the night watch, with 2 men on duty at all times instead of the usual one. April lay awake in the wagon, listening to every sound, jumping at the occasional snap of twigs or distant animal cry. After what seemed like hours, she heard soft footsteps approaching the wagon. She tensed until Max's familiar voice called softly, "It's just me, April." She sat up, peering over the edge of the wagon. "Is everything all right, all quiet?" Max assured her, his face half hidden in shadow. "Just checking that you're resting." "I can't sleep," April admitted. "Not with those men out there somewhere." Max nodded, understanding. Would it help if I sat nearby for a while? April hesitated only briefly before nodding. Max settled himself on the ground beside the wagon, his back against a wheel, rifle across his knees. "Tell me about Fort Worth," he said softly. "What do you know of it?" April recognized his attempt to distract her from her fears. "Not much," she admitted. "My cousin Betsy writes that it's growing quickly. Her husband works at a lumber mill there." "It is growing," Max agreed. "The railroad came through last year, brought a lot of new business, new people. It's not the wild cow town it once was." "Have you spent much time there?" Max chuckled softly. "Enough to know which saloons to avoid. It's a good place, though. You could do well there." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the night and the occasional snore from a sleeping cowboy. "What will you do after this drive?" April asked eventually. Max was quiet for a long moment. "I haven't decided," he finally said. "There's another drive starting in San Antonio next month, or I might winter in Fort Worth, see what opportunities present themselves." The thought of Max staying in Fort Worth sent a flutter through April's chest that she quickly suppressed. "I'm sure you'll find something suitable," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Perhaps," Max replied, and something in his tone made April wish she could see his expression clearly. "You should try to sleep now. We've got another long day tomorrow." "Good night, Max," April said softly. "Thank you for checking on me." "Good night, April," he replied, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the darkness. April lay back down, expecting to hear Max's footsteps retreating. But he remained where he was, a silent guardian beside her wagon, and somehow, knowing he was there allowed her to finally drift into sleep. The next morning dawned clear and warm, with no sign of the suspicious riders. April awoke feeling better than she had in days, her morning sickness less severe. As she helped Cookie prepare breakfast, she found herself humming softly, earning a surprised glance from the old cook. "You're in fine spirits today, Mrs. Yates," he observed. April smiled. "It's a beautiful morning, Cookie, and we're getting closer to Fort Worth every day." Cookie grunted noncommittally, but April caught the hint of a smile beneath his grizzled beard. Even the crusty old cook had warmed to her over the past weeks. The good mood continued throughout the morning as the drive moved steadily northeast. April rode in the wagon as usual, but today the jolting seemed less bothersome, the heat less oppressive. She spent the hours mending shirts and socks, occasionally exchanging waves with Max as he rode past the wagon checking on his herd. It was just past noon when the first shot rang out. April dropped the shirt she was mending as Cookie cursed and pulled the wagon to a sharp halt. Ahead, she could see Max and his men racing toward a commotion at the front of the herd. Guns drawn, more shots followed, and then the thunder of hooves as a portion of the herd broke away, stampeding across the plain. Through the dust and chaos, April caught glimpses of riders not Max's men but others, driving the cattle deliberately away from the main herd. Rustlers, Cookie spat, reaching beneath his seat for an old shotgun. "Stay down, Mrs. Yates." April ducked low in the wagon, her heart pounding as she peered through the slats. She could make out Max's tall figure on horseback, pursuing the rustlers, firing his pistol. Several of his men followed close behind. The scarred man from the creek was among the rustlers, his face contorted with rage as he wheeled his horse around to fire back at Max. April gasped as the bullet seemed to find its mark. Max swayed in his saddle but didn't fall. The chase disappeared into a stand of trees, leaving the wagon and remaining cattle in an eerie silence broken only by the nervous lowing of the animals. Cookie kept his shotgun ready, scanning the horizon for any sign of the rustlers returning. Will they be all right? April asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cookie's weathered face was grim. "Boss knows what he's doing, but them rustlers are desperate men, no telling what they might do when cornered." The minutes stretched endlessly as April waited, every muscle tense with fear. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she held her breath until she saw it was Illy, riding hard toward the wagon. "Cookie, Mrs. Yates," he called as he reined in his horse. "Boss says to move the wagon and remaining herd to that stand of trees to the east. More defensible position in case they come back." "What happened to the rustlers?" Cookie demanded. We got most of the cattle back, lost maybe 30 head, Illy reported. Shot one of the rustlers, the other two, including that scarred fella, got away, and the men, any injuries? April asked anxiously. Illy hesitated, and April's heart clenched. Bart took a bullet in the arm, nothing too serious, and the boss. He looked away briefly. Boss was hit, but he says it's just a graze. Where is he? April was already reaching for her small bag of medical supplies, a parting gift from Mary Foster. He's bringing up the rear with the recovered cattle, Illy said. Sent me ahead to make sure you two were safe. Cookie wasted no time, turning the wagon toward the stand of trees Illy had indicated. April held tight to the seat, scanning the horizon for any sign of Max, her worry growing with every passing minute. It was nearly an hour later when the rest of the men appeared, driving the cattle before them. April's eyes immediately found Max, riding tall despite the dark stains spreading across his left shoulder. As soon as the wagon stopped in the shelter of the trees, she jumped down, medical bag in hand. Max dismounted stiffly, wincing as his boots hit the ground. Up close, April could see the pallor beneath his tan, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of pain he was trying to hide. It's nothing, he said before she could speak. Barely a scratch. Let me be the judge of that, April replied firmly, taking his arm and leading him to a fallen log where he could sit. Take off your shirt. Max raised an eyebrow at her commanding tone but complied, unbuttoning his shirt with his good arm. April helped him ease the blood-soaked fabric off his wounded shoulder, biting her lip at the angry red furrow the bullet had carved across his upper arm. You call this a scratch, she chided, opening her medical bag. You're lucky it didn't hit anything vital. Told you it wasn't serious, Max said, though his clenched jaw belied his casual words. April cleaned the wound carefully, grateful that Mary had insisted she take a small bottle of carbolic acid. Max hissed when she applied it but didn't pull away. I need to stitch this, she told him, threading a needle. Max nodded, bracing himself. Go ahead. April took a deep breath, steadying her hands. She'd assisted Mary with similar procedures but had never done the stitching herself. The first insertion of the needle made Max flinch, but after that, he remained stone still as she worked. Where did you learn to do this? He asked, watching her careful movements. Mary Foster taught me some basic medical skills, April explained, focusing on making the stitches neat and even. She said every woman should know how to treat injuries, especially in a place like Desdemona where the doctor only visits once a month. Max was silent for a moment, then said softly, You continue to surprise me, April Yates. April glanced up, momentarily caught in his intense blue gaze. How so? Most women would be hysterical after what happened today. You're as calm as if you're mending a shirt instead of a man. April returned her attention to her work, not wanting him to see how his words affected her. Hysterics never solved anything, she said simply. When she finished the last stitch and snipped the thread, she sat back to examine her work. It will scar, but it should heal cleanly if you keep it clean and don't tear the stitches. Thank you, Max said, reaching for his ruined shirt. You can't wear that, April protested. It's filthy. I have one of Thomas's shirts in my trunk. It should fit you well enough until I can wash and mend yours. Max looked like he might object, but then nodded. I'd appreciate that. April retrieved the shirt from her trunk, one of the few items of Thomas's she'd brought with her, planning to use the fabric for the baby's clothes eventually. As she handed it to Max, the significance of the moment struck her. Her dead husband's shirt on the shoulders of a man who was becoming increasingly important to her. If Max recognized the intimacy of the gesture, he didn't show it, merely thanking her as he carefully pulled the clean shirt on over his wounded arm. Will the rustlers come back? April asked as she packed away her medical supplies. Max shook his head. Not likely. They know we're alert now and they lost one of their own. There are easier targets. He stood, testing his arm cautiously, but we'll keep double watches until we reach Fort Worth, just to be safe. You should rest, April urged. You've lost blood. Max smiled wryly. Trail bosses don't get to rest, April, but I'll take it easier than usual for the rest of the day, I promise. As he walked away to check on his men and cattle, April watched him go with a mixture of admiration and something deeper. something that frightened her with its intensity. In that moment, tending his wound, feeling his strength beneath her hands, she had realized with startling clarity that her feelings for Maxwell York had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. And in 3 more days, they would reach Fort Worth, and she would likely never see him again. The thought lodged in her chest like a physical pain, sharper than any grief she'd felt for Thomas. It was wrong, she knew it was wrong to feel this way so soon after becoming a widow, to compare the 2 men and find her husband wanting. Yet she couldn't deny the truth of her heart, no matter how inappropriate or ill-timed these feelings might be. That night after dinner, Max came to sit beside her at the fire as had become their custom. His wounded arm was held stiffly at his side, but otherwise he showed no signs of the day's trauma. "How are you feeling?" April asked, studying his face in the firelight for signs of fever or pain. "Well enough," Max replied with a small smile. "Your stitching is holding nicely." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the flames dance. "We should reach Fort Worth by midday on Thursday," Max finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you know where your cousin lives?" "She gave me an address in her letter," April confirmed. "Somewhere near the lumber mill, I believe," Max nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "I can take you there, make sure you arrive safely." "Thank you," April said softly. "That's very kind." Another silence fell, heavier this time, laden with unspoken words. "April," Max began, then hesitated. "I've been thinking." April's heart quickened. "Yes." Max seemed to struggle with his thoughts, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Your situation in Fort Worth, living with a cousin you barely know, expecting a child, looking for work, it won't be easy." "I know," April acknowledged, "but I have few alternatives." Max nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her face. "There is one alternative you might consider." He took a deep breath. "You could marry me." April stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" Max finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious in the flickering light. "I'm asking you to marry me, April. I know it's sudden, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. I don't expect you to love me, at least not right away, but I can offer you protection, security for you and your child." April's mind reeled. "Max, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to answer now," Max said quickly. "Think about it. We have 3 days before Fort Worth." "Why?" April asked, finding her voice. "Why would you do this?" Max's expression softened. "Because in these past weeks, I've come to care for you, April. More than I should, perhaps, given your circumstances, but I believe we could build a good life together. I have savings enough to start fresh somewhere. I'd raise your child as my own, give it my name. And what would people think?" A widow remarrying so quickly to a man she met on a cattle drive. "I don't give a damn what people think," Max said firmly. "All that matters is what's best for you and your child." April's emotions warred within her: longing, guilt, fear, hope. "I need time to think," she finally said. Max nodded, rising from his place by the fire. "Take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, I'll respect your choice." He hesitated, then added softly, "Good night, April." "Good night, Max," she whispered, watching him walk away into the darkness. Sleep eluded April that night, as she turned Max's proposal over and over in her mind. Marriage to Maxwell York would solve so many of her problems. She would have security, protection, a father for her child, and she couldn't deny her growing feelings for him, but was it fair to either of them? To marry when she was still officially in mourning for Thomas. Would Max eventually resent raising another man's child? Would she always feel she had accepted him out of desperation rather than love? By morning, she was no closer to a decision. She went about her duties mechanically, aware of Max's eyes on her throughout the day but unable to meet his gaze. He kept his distance, true to his word about giving her time to think. That evening, as April sat alone by the fire after most of the men had turned in, she was surprised when old Cookie came to sit beside her, his arthritis-twisted hands clutching a cup of coffee. "Forgive an old man for speaking out of turn," he said without preamble, "but I've been watching you wrestle with something all day, and I reckon I know what it is." April looked at him in surprise. "You do?" Cookie nodded, sipping his coffee. "The boss asked you to marry him, didn't he?" April felt her cheeks flush. "How did you know?" Cookie chuckled. Been on enough drives with Maxwell York to know when that man's got something on his mind, and the way he looks at you. Well, it wasn't hard to figure. April stared into the fire, unsure how to respond. You're worried about what people will think, Cookie continued. About marrying so soon after your husband's passing. April nodded slowly. Among other things. Let me tell you something, Mrs. Yates. I've lived 72 years in this world, and the one thing I've learned is that life's too short to let other folks' opinions dictate your happiness. He took another sip of coffee. My Caroline and I had only known each other 3 weeks when we wed. Her family thought she was making a terrible mistake, marrying a drifter like me. We had 47 good years together before she passed. April smiled softly at the story. You miss her. Every day, Cookie confirmed. But I never once regretted marrying her, no matter what anyone said. He fixed April with a surprisingly sharp gaze. The boss is a good man, best I've ever worked for. He'd treat you right, and that baby too. I believe he would, April admitted. Then what's really holding you back? Guilt? April looked down at her hands. Partly. It feels disloyal to Thomas to move on so quickly. Cookie was quiet for a moment, then said gently, Your husband wouldn't want you to struggle alone, Mrs. Yates, not when there's a good man offering to care for you and his child. Tears pricked April's eyes at Cookie's words. You're very wise, Mr. Cookie. The old cook snorted. Just old enough to have seen a lot of life, that's all. He stood with a groan, his joints protesting. You think on what I said, and whatever you decide, you've got friends on this drive who wish you well. As Cookie shuffled away, April remained by the fire, his words echoing in her mind. Perhaps he was right, perhaps Thomas would want her to find happiness, to ensure security for their child. And if her heart was already turning toward Max, wasn't that a sign that this was the right path? The next morning, April woke with her decision made. She waited until the drive stopped for a noon rest, then approached Max where he sat checking his saddle for wear. Could we speak privately? She asked quietly. Max looked up, surprise and hope flickering across his features. Of course. He led her a short distance from camp, to a spot beneath a lone oak tree where they could speak without being overheard. I've been thinking about your proposal, April began, her heart racing. And I have some questions before I can give you an answer. Max nodded, waiting patiently. If we married, where would we live? April asked. You said you've been on the trail for 6 years. Would you be content to settle in one place? I would, Max answered without hesitation. In fact, I've been considering it for some time. There's good land outside Fort Worth, or we could go elsewhere if you prefer. San Antonio, Austin, even back toward Desdemona if you wanted to be near familiar places. Not Desdemona, April said quickly. I couldn't face Margaret again. Then we'll go wherever you like, Max assured her. I have enough saved to buy a small ranch or a business in town if that would suit you better. April considered his words. And the baby, you truly accept another man's child as your own, Max's expression softened. April, that child is a part of you. How could I not love it? I would be proud to give it my name, to raise it as my own son or daughter. And if people talk about how quickly I remarried, let them talk, Max said firmly. We would know the truth of our situation, and in time they would see the truth of our marriage and forget how it began. April took a deep breath, gathering her courage for the most important question. And what of? Feelings, Max. You said you don't expect me to love you right away. But what if I already have feelings for you, feelings that confuse and frighten me because they seem disloyal to Thomas's memory? Max's eyes widened slightly, hope dawning in their blue depths. Do you have feelings for me, I mean? April nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Max reached out to take her hand in his. April, I believe I've been falling in love with you since the day you asked to join this cattle drive. Your strength, your kindness, your determination, everything about you calls to something in me I thought was long dead. Tears spilled down April's cheeks at his words. I feel the same, she whispered, and it terrifies me how quickly and deeply these feelings have grown. Then let's face that fear together, Max said, gently wiping away a tear with his thumb. Marry me, April. Not out of necessity or practicality, but because we've found something rare and precious on this long road to Fort Worth. April looked up into his earnest face, and in that moment, the last of her doubts fell away. Yes, she said simply. "I will marry you, Maxwell York." The smile that broke across Max's face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. "You won't regret it, I promise you." "I know," April said, and for the first time in weeks, her heart felt truly light. They returned to camp hand in hand, drawing curious glances from the cowboys. Max called for everyone's attention, his face alight with joy. "Men, I have an announcement," he said, his deep voice carrying across the camp. "Mrs. Yates has done me the great honor of agreeing to become Mrs. York when we reach Fort Worth tomorrow." A moment of stunned silence was followed by whoops and cheers from the men. Old Cookie was the first to approach them, his weathered face split by a rare full smile as he shook Max's hand and patted April's arm awkwardly. "Couldn't be happier for you both," he said gruffly. "Always knew the boss had good sense." One by one, the cowboys offered their congratulations, their genuine happiness for their boss evident in their faces. Even Frank, who had spread rumors about April before, came forward to shake Max's hand and offer a somewhat sheepish apology to April. The remainder of the day's journey took on a festive air, with the men singing trail songs and telling stories as they rode. April rode in the wagon as usual, but now Max stayed close by whenever his duties allowed, planning their future together. "We'll find a preacher as soon as we reach town," he told her. "Then we can visit your cousin, let her know of your change in plans." April nodded, happiness bubbling within her even as a shadow of doubt crossed her mind. "Max, are you certain you want to marry so quickly? We could wait a proper period, observe the mourning customs." Max shook his head firmly. "I've waited 6 years to find a woman who makes me feel this way, April. I won't wait a day longer than necessary to make you my wife." His expression softened. "Unless you need more time, if you're not ready, no," April interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "I'm ready. I want to be your wife, Max." The look of pure joy on his face was all the confirmation she needed that she was making the right choice. That night, their last on the trail, Max and April sat by the fire long after the other men had turned in, planning their future together. They would marry immediately upon reaching Fort Worth, then find a small house to rent while Max looked for land to buy. They would tell people that April was a young widow whom Max had known before her first marriage, close enough to the truth to be believable, far enough from it to avoid gossip about their hasty union. "And when the baby comes?" April asked, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. "We'll say it came early," Max said simply. "But among ourselves, we'll always honor the truth that this child is a gift from your first husband, a part of Thomas that lives on." April felt tears prick her eyes at Max's words. "You're a good man, Maxwell York," he smiled, taking her hand gently. "And you, April Yates, soon to be York, are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." They reached the outskirts of Fort Worth shortly after noon the next day. The town had grown significantly since Max's last visit, with new buildings springing up along Main Street and the railroad station bustling with activity. Max left the herd in the capable hands of his second in command, with instructions to drive the cattle to the holding pens north of town. He and April, along with Old Cookie who had volunteered to serve as witness, took the wagon directly to the small white church on Weatherford Street. The Reverend, a kindly older man named Johnson, was initially reluctant to perform a marriage ceremony for a couple he didn't know, especially when he learned April was recently widowed. But Max's earnest explanation of their circumstances, altered to protect April's reputation and Cookie's staunch vouching for their characters, eventually won him over. "I can see the love between you," Reverend Johnson said finally. "And in these frontier times, practicality often must take precedence over convention. I will marry you today." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. April wore her best dress, a navy blue cotton with white lace at the collar that she had carefully preserved for their arrival in Fort Worth. Max, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt borrowed from one of his men, looked more handsome than April had ever seen him. As they exchanged vows, April felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't how she had imagined her life unfolding when she'd left Desdemona 3 weeks ago, but standing before God and promising to love and honor Maxwell York felt more right than anything had since Thomas's death. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Johnson declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. York." Max's kiss was gentle yet powerful, a promise of the love and protection he had vowed to provide. When they parted, April saw tears shining in his blue eyes, tears that matched her own. "Mrs. York," he whispered, the name a caress on his lips. "Mr. York," she replied, smiling through her tears. After signing the marriage certificate and thanking Reverend Johnson, the newly wedded couple and Cookie returned to the wagon. "Well," Cookie said with gruff affection, "I reckon this is where I take my leave. Got to get back to the herd, make sure those boys haven't let everything go to ruin." "Thank you, Cookie," April said warmly, embracing the startled old man. "For everything." Cookie patted her back awkwardly. "You take care of the boss, Mrs. York, and that little one too." Max shook Cookie's hand firmly. "Tell the men I'll meet them at the Cattleman's Hotel tomorrow to pay their wages. And Cookie, I won't be joining the next drive. I've got a family to think about now." Cookie nodded, understanding in his roomy eyes. "Been a privilege riding with you, boss. You know where to find me if you ever need an old cook for that ranch you're planning." As Cookie drove the wagon back toward the holding pens, Max turned to April. "Well, Mrs. York, shall we pay a visit to your cousin? I think we have some news to share." April nodded, suddenly nervous about how Betsy would react to her whirlwind marriage. But with Max's hand firmly holding hers, she found the courage to face whatever came next. Betsy Wilson's modest home sat on a quiet street near the lumber mill where her husband worked. The sound of children playing could be heard through the open windows as April and Max approached the front door. A plump woman with April's same chestnut hair opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "April, is that you? We weren't expecting you until next week." "Hello, Betsy," April said, accepting her cousin's enthusiastic embrace. "I hope it's not an inconvenience that we're early." Betsy finally noticed Max standing behind April. "Not at all. And who is this gentleman?" April took a deep breath. "Betsy, I'd like you to meet Maxwell York, my husband." Betsy's mouth fell open in shock. But I thought. In your letter, you said Thomas had passed and you needed a place to stay while you. Perhaps we could explain inside," Max suggested gently, aware of curious neighbors watching from nearby porches. Betsy flushed and quickly ushered them in. The small front room was neat but crowded with evidence of children: a wooden horse on the floor, a doll on the sofa, a slate with childish writing propped against a chair. "The children are out back with their father," Betsy explained distractedly. "Now, please, tell me what's happened. Your letter said you were a widow in need of shelter." April sat on the sofa, Max beside her, and told Betsy an abbreviated version of events: how she joined the cattle drive to reach Fort Worth, how she and Max had grown close during the journey, how they had married just hours ago. She omitted any mention of her pregnancy, deciding that news could wait until she and Betsy had re-established their connection. Betsy listened with increasing wonder. "Well," she said when April finished, "this is certainly not what I expected when I offered you a place to stay." She turned to Max, studying him with frank curiosity. "And you, Mr. York, what are your intentions toward my cousin?" "To love and protect her for the rest of my life," Max replied simply. "I know our marriage seems sudden, but I assure you my feelings for April are deep and genuine." Betsy's expression softened. "I can see that, and I haven't seen April look so alive since we were girls." She reached out to take April's hand. "If you're happy, then I'm happy for you." "I am happy," April said, and was surprised to realize how completely true it was. Despite the whirlwind of changes, despite the lingering grief for Thomas, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she was happy with Max by her side. "Then you must both stay here tonight," Betsy declared. "Tomorrow you can look for a place of your own, but tonight we'll celebrate your marriage properly with a family dinner." April felt tears prick her eyes at her cousin's acceptance. "Thank you, Betsy." That evening, surrounded by Betsy's boisterous family, her husband John and their 3 children April and Max shared their first meal as husband and wife. The children were fascinated by Max's stories of cattle drives and life on the trail, while John offered advice about property in and around Fort Worth. "If it's ranching you're interested in," John said as they enjoyed Betsy's apple pie for dessert, "there's good land available about 10 miles west of town. Not too expensive yet, but it will be once more folks realize the railroad makes shipping cattle so much easier." Max nodded thoughtfully. "I'll look into it tomorrow. For now, we need a place to live while I get established." "There's a small house for rent just 2 streets over," Betsy offered. "Nothing fancy, but clean and private. The Jenkins family just moved to Dallas last week." April exchanged a smile with Max, the pieces of their new life falling into place more quickly than they could have hoped. Later that night, in the small guest bedroom Betsy had prepared for them, April and Max faced the reality of being truly alone together as husband and wife for the first time. Despite their feelings for each other, there was an undeniable awkwardness as they prepared for bed. "I can sleep on the floor," Max offered, sensing April's nervousness. "There's no rush, April. We have the rest of our lives." April looked up at him, this man who had changed her life so completely in just 3 weeks. "No," she said softly. "I don't want you on the floor. I want to be a real wife to you, Max." Max crossed the room slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When he reached her, he cupped her face gently in his large hands. "Are you certain? I meant what I said, there's no rush." In answer, April rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. Unlike the chaste kiss they had shared at their wedding, this one deepened quickly, years of loneliness and weeks of growing feelings pouring into a connection that left them both breathless. "I'm certain," April whispered against his lips. And as Max gathered her in his arms and carried her to the bed, April knew she had found not just security or protection in this marriage, but a love deeper and more powerful than anything she had known before. The next 2 months passed in a whirlwind of activity for the newlyweds. They rented the house Betsy had mentioned, a small but sturdy 2-bedroom home with a decent kitchen and a tiny garden out back. Max used his savings to purchase 200 acres of land west of Fort Worth, just as John had suggested. The property included a simple ranch house that needed work, but was habitable, a barn, and several outbuildings. While Max hired workers to help repair fencing and prepare for the cattle he planned to purchase, April made their rented house a home. She sewed curtains, planted vegetables in the garden, and became reacquainted with her cousin's family. She also, finally, told Betsy about her pregnancy. "I suspected as much," Betsy said with a knowing smile when April shared the news. "You have that glow about you. And the way you rushed to marry Max, it makes more sense now." "You don't think poorly of me?" April asked anxiously. "For marrying again so quickly, carrying one man's child while taking another's name," Betsy squeezed her hand. "April, in this world, women must do what they can to survive. You found not just survival but happiness with Max. How could anyone think poorly of that?" She paused, then asked gently, "And Max, he's truly accepting of the child?" "More than accepting," April said, her voice warm with love. "He speaks to the baby at night, tells it stories about the ranch he's building for us. He says he can't wait to teach his son or daughter to ride." "Then you are blessed indeed," Betsy declared. "Now we must start preparing a layette. That baby will be here before you know it." As summer turned to fall, April's pregnancy became more visible. She and Max moved to the ranch house, which now had new windows, a repaired roof, and freshly painted walls. Max had purchased 50 head of cattle to start their herd, with plans to expand gradually. He'd also hired 2 young cowboys to help with the daily work, though he insisted on doing most of the heavy labor himself. April found joy in creating a real home for them, planting a garden near the house, arranging their few pieces of furniture to make the most of the space, and preparing the small 2nd bedroom for the baby's arrival. In the evenings, she and Max would sit on the porch, watching the Texas sunset and talking about their future. "I never thought I could be this happy again," April admitted one October evening, her head resting on Max's shoulder, his hand gently caressing her rounded belly. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. And I never thought I'd find someone who would make me want to stop wandering," Max replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. You've given me roots, April, a purpose beyond just the next cattle drive or the next town. The baby kicked beneath Max's hand, making them both laugh. Strong little one, Max said proudly. Just like his mother, or her, April reminded him. It could be a girl, son or daughter, it doesn't matter, Max said firmly. This child will be loved, April, I promise you that. November brought the first real cold snap of the year, and with it, an unexpected visitor to the York ranch. April was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the sound of a carriage approaching. Wiping her hands on her apron, she went to the window and froze at the sight of the familiar black carriage with the Yates family crest on its door. Margaret Yates had found her. April's hand instinctively went to her stomach, now prominently rounded at 7 months. She had known this day might come. Fort Worth wasn't so large that her presence could remain a secret forever, especially as Max became known in ranching circles, and they attended church in town each Sunday. But she had hoped for more time, for the baby to be born, for her new life with Max to be more firmly established before facing her past. The sharp knock at the door made her jump. Taking a deep breath, April squared her shoulders and went to answer it, praying that Max would return soon from checking the north pasture. Margaret Yates stood on the porch, her tall figure as imposing as ever, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun beneath her black hat. Her eyes widened at the sight of April's pregnant form, shock momentarily replacing the cold disdain that typically characterized her expression. So it's true, Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. Not only did you flee Desdemona like a thief in the night, but you've already remarried. And carrying a child. Her eyes narrowed. A child that must be my son's. April stood straighter, one hand protectively on her belly. Hello, Margaret, won't you come in? The courtesy was automatic, though she dreaded the conversation to come. Margaret stepped into the house, her critical gaze sweeping over the simple but comfortable furnishings. I heard rumors that Thomas's widow had been seen in Fort Worth, married to a rancher named York. I didn't want to believe it that you would dishonor my son's memory so completely. I have not dishonored Thomas, April said firmly. Yes, I remarried, and yes, I am carrying Thomas's child, a grandchild you would have known about if you hadn't thrown me out of my home immediately after his funeral. Margaret's face flushed. You were never worthy of the Yates name. Always too common, too simple for my Thomas. And now look at you, barely widowed and already in another man's bed, living in this. She gestured dismissively, this hovel. This is my home, April said, her voice steady despite the angry tears threatening to fall. The home I'm building with my husband, a good man who has shown me more kindness and respect in 4 months than you did in 3 years of marriage to your son. Your husband, Margaret spat. Does he know you're carrying another man's child? Or did you trick him into marriage, pretending the baby is his? Max knows everything, April replied. He's proud to give this child his name, to raise Thomas's child as his own. I won't allow it, Margaret declared. That child is a Yates by blood, the last of the Yates line. It belongs with family with me, not with some stranger. April felt cold fear grip her heart. The baby stays with me, Margaret, its mother. We'll see about that, Margaret said, her voice dangerously soft. I have friends in high places, April. Judges who understand the importance of family name and heritage. Once the child is born, I will petition for custody. A new widow who remarried indecently quickly, living on a remote ranch, I don't think the courts will find you a suitable mother. Before April could respond, the door opened and Max entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. April, I saw the carriage. He trailed off as he took in the scene before him, April pale and trembling, the elegantly dressed older woman standing rigidly in their sitting room. Max, April said, relief flooding her voice, this is Margaret Yates, Thomas's mother. Max removed his hat, his expression carefully neutral as he crossed to stand beside April, his arm going protectively around her waist. Mrs. Yates, I've heard a great deal about you. Margaret's cold eyes assessed him from head to toe. Mr. York, I wish I could say the same about you, but my daughter-in-law neglected to inform me of her hasty remarriage. My wife owes you no explanations, Max said, his voice calm but firm. Not after the way you treated her following your son's death. Your wife, Margaret repeated with contempt. She was my son's wife first, Mr. York, and she carries his child, my grandchild, a child I intend to raise in the Yates tradition with the advantages of the Yates name. Max's arm tightened around April. That won't be happening, Mrs. Yates. This child is our child now, April's and mine. It will be raised with love and care, knowing about its birth father but bearing my name proudly. Margaret's lips thinned to a white line. We'll see what the courts have to say about that. A mother-in-law with wealth and standing against a widow who couldn't wait to jump into another man's bed. That's enough, Max interrupted, his voice suddenly hard as steel. You will not speak of my wife that way in our home. April is the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever known. She faced heartbreak and cruelty with dignity. She worked alongside men on a cattle drive to reach safety. And every day, she shows me what true grace looks like. April stared up at Max, tears of gratitude filling her eyes at his fierce defense. You called her useless, Max continued, his blue eyes boring into Margaret. But April is everything I've ever needed in this world. She's the heart of this ranch, the center of my life. And she will be an extraordinary mother to our child. Margaret seemed momentarily taken aback by Max's intensity, but she quickly recovered her composure. Pretty words, Mr. York, but they won't change the facts. That child is a Yates. That child is a York now, Max countered. And if you pursue this through the courts, you'll find I can be a formidable opponent. I may not have your wealth, Mrs. Yates, but I have friends, 2 men who rode with me, fought beside me, who would testify to my character and April's. The judge would also be very interested to hear how you cast out a pregnant widow with nowhere to go. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. You can't keep me from my grandchild. We don't want to, April said, finding her voice again. If you can approach us with respect and kindness, you would be welcome to visit to be part of this child's life. But as a grandmother, Margaret, not as a replacement mother. Margaret stood silent for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she said, I will consider your offer. But don't think this is over. With that, she swept toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. I'll return after the child is born. We'll discuss terms then. After she left, April sagged against Max, her legs suddenly weak with relief and lingering fear. Max guided her to the sofa, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. Are you all right? He asked, searching her face with concern. April nodded, though tears spilled down her cheeks. Thank you for what you said, for defending me. Max reached up to wipe away her tears. I meant every word, April. You are all I've ever needed, and we will protect our child together, I promise you that. What if she does go to court? April whispered. She has money, influence. And we have truth on our side, Max said firmly. Plus, judges tend to favor keeping children with their mothers, especially infants. Margaret knows that it's why she's making threats instead of taking action. She's hoping to frighten you into submission. April took a shaky breath. She always did rule by fear. Even Thomas was afraid to stand up to her sometimes. Max pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. You're not alone anymore, April. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That night, as they lay in bed, the baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing the day's tension. Max placed his hand on April's belly, smiling as he felt the movement. Strong and stubborn, he observed. Like both its parents. April covered his hand with her own. I was so afraid today, Max, not just of Margaret taking the baby, but afraid you might see how complicated all this is and regret marrying me. Max propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with such tenderness that April's heart ached. April York, marrying you is the best decision I've ever made. Yes, our situation is complicated. Yes, there may be challenges ahead, but there is not a single moment when I have regretted making you my wife. April reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. I love you, Maxwell York, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, April York, he replied, bending to kiss her softly. Now and always. 2 weeks before Christmas, during a rare Texas snowfall, April went into labor. The baby came quickly, barely giving Max time to fetch Betsy, who had promised to help with the delivery. As the first light of dawn broke over the ranch, April gave birth to a healthy boy with a thatch of dark hair and Thomas's cleft chin. He's perfect, Max whispered, tears in his eyes as he held his son for the first time. What shall we name him?" April looked up at her husband, exhausted but radiant. "I thought perhaps Thomas Maxwell York, to honor both his fathers." Max's eyes widened with surprise and emotion. "Are you sure?" April nodded. "I want him to know where he came from, but also who raised him with love. Who chose to be his father." Max bent to kiss her, his heart too full for words. Little Thomas seemed to approve, gurgling contentedly in his father's strong arms. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights, joyful discoveries, and the everyday miracles of new parenthood. Max proved to be a natural father, as gentle with the tiny boy as he was strong with his ranch duties. April watched them together, Max cradling Thomas against his broad chest, singing old trail songs as lullabies, and felt her heart might burst with happiness. Margaret Yates arrived on New Year's Day, her carriage once again pulling up to the ranch house without warning. This time, however, April was prepared. She greeted her former mother-in-law at the door with Thomas in her arms, Max standing supportively beside her. Margaret's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly at the sight of the baby. "He looks like my Thomas did," she said quietly. "Would you like to hold your grandson?" April offered, extending the sleeping infant. Margaret hesitated only briefly before reaching for the child. As she cradled him, her usual rigid posture relaxed, and something like wonder crossed her face. "His name is Thomas Maxwell York," April said. "Named for both his fathers." Margaret looked up sharply, but there was less hostility in her gaze than before. "You gave him Thomas's name." "Of course," April replied. "He should know about the good man who gave him life, even if he isn't here to raise him." Margaret studied the baby's face for a long moment, then looked between April and Max. Something in her expression shifted, a reluctant acknowledgement of what she saw between them. "I still don't approve of how quickly you remarried," she said finally. "But perhaps I was hasty in my judgment of your situation." She returned her attention to the baby. "He deserves to know his heritage, his family history." "We agree," Max said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Which is why you're welcome to visit your grandson regularly, to be part of his life as he grows, if you can respect our family and our home." Margaret seemed to struggle internally before nodding once, a sharp movement that nonetheless conveyed her acquiescence. "I would appreciate that opportunity." It wasn't exactly peace, but it was a beginning a truce for the sake of the child they all loved. As spring returned to Texas, the York ranch flourished. The cattle herd grew, the gardens bloomed, and little Thomas thrived under the adoring attention of his parents. Margaret visited once a month, gradually unbending enough to occasionally acknowledge Max's role in providing a good home for her grandson. On a warm April evening, exactly 1 year after April had first approached Maxwell York asking for passage on his cattle drive, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house. Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle beside them, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm of innocent slumber. "Happy anniversary," Max said softly, taking April's hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. April smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not of our wedding day," "No," Max agreed, "but of the day that changed everything. The day you walked into my life and turned it upside down in the best possible way." April laughed softly. "I was so desperate that day, so afraid of what the future held. I never imagined it would lead to this, to you, to our son, to this beautiful life we've built." Max pulled her closer, his arms strong and secure around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Desdemona, joining the cattle drive, marrying a rough cowboy like me?" April turned her face up to his, her eyes shining with love and certainty. "Not for a single moment, Maxwell York. You saw value in me when others called me useless. You became the father my son needed when he had none. You made me believe in second chances, in new beginnings." She reached up to touch his face tenderly. "You are all I ever needed, Max, all I will ever need." As the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maxwell York bent to kiss his wife, silently thanking whatever twist of fate had brought this remarkable woman into his life. Together they had overcome grief, judgment, and uncertainty to forge a family bound not by blood alone, but by choice and love, the strongest bonds of all. And as young Thomas stirred in his cradle, reaching out a tiny hand as if to touch the future that awaited him. April and Max exchanged a smile of perfect understanding. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything else. Together, with courage, with determination, and with an abiding love that had blossomed against all odds on the long road from Desdemona to home.